Greetings, YouTube. If I'm not the most bright-eyed at the moment, forgive me. I literally rolled out of bed about 13 minutes ago. Um, there has been a lot of discussion on the boards I've seen concerning Wizard of the Coast's handling of the racist past of non-human races in games, and how the industry handles the term race itself within a fantasy setting or science fiction, I suppose. Race is a very loaded term. It always has been. I have never liked using the term race when we're referring to human beings. You know, the classic race, creed, and color, that kind of thing. But we're one species, even if we are divided into three very broad categories of, Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, which are Europeans, Asians, and Africans, roughly. Those are very archaic terms. I know this. I apologize. I am also apparently very stuffy. Pollen count must be through the roof. But racists use the term. And we discuss racism, which is a legitimate term, racist, racism, things like that. So the term is in play, even if I don't like the fact that we use the word race. And I'm not saying that to whitewash the situation, pardon the pun, but the reality is we are one species. We always have been. We will always be one species unless we do some really severe tinkering with our genetic codes. But in fantasy settings and science fiction, tabletop role-playing games, race means something a little more overt. Halflings, orcs, dwarves, elves, snake people, giants, half-ogres. Those are what we refer to, but that is also a very loaded situation where it's very easy to fall into tropes, and you end up with monocultures, and you end up with severe stereotypes, like for some strange reason, why is it that dwarves always have Scottish accents? So I can understand why in the year 2020 people want to address this, and they want to come forward and say, hey, maybe we want to have orcs that are not so goddamn racist, because I know that Tolkien wasn't as bad as Lovecraft, but there's no way to escape the racism baked in to the Middle-earth that Tolkien created, because it's there. And whenever I hear people talking about the history of Tolkien's setting, and the community that grew up around it and everything, and the fan base and things like that, and they don't address the racism, I can almost guarantee you that the person writing the article is white. Because a person of color, a black person, or an Indian person or something, they would be looking at this and going, hey, yeah, Tolkien wrote this really great story, but, the racism there, let's talk about it. And people don't like to. And it's easy for the white folks of the universe to ignore it. So I can completely understand not wanting to tackle that. But we still have to use terms to help us discuss dwarves and halflings and orcs and half-giants and stuff. So what do we use? Now, recently I've heard that within the D&D community that is surrounding Wizards of the Coast, now I realize that since 4th edition, I've completely separated myself from Wizards of the Coast, so I am not up to date. I'm getting this information filtered through the message boards that I read. That they'll be using the terms ancestry and culture. And I kind of really like this for a for a fantasy setting. Ancestry and culture are really good terms in my mind to help us discuss the fact that whose person's background is that their entire family line is they're halflings. Their ancestry is that they are halflings, and that is a neutral term. It doesn't carry the weight and the baggage of race. And maybe we should start separating some of the things that we have baked into race in the past that really aren't race. We should separate the biological aspects of someone's ancestry from their cultural aspects. For example, there are biological aspects of being human, but there are also cultural aspects about being human. If you adopt me the day I was born in New Zealand, I would still look the same, but I would have a much different cultural background. Okay, I'd still be the whitest white boy that ever walked out of White Town, but I would not have this accent, and I would not have developed the same tastes and things. That'd be kind of intriguing. What would my hobbies be if I'd been dropped in New Zealand? Would I still build weapons for a hobby? Would I still be a gamer? Okay, that's a different video. And I think it's important that we separate those two things. I think it's important that we should, that if there is an urban culture, we're going to bring some broad generalizations here. I realize that New York urban folks are different from Parisian urban folks, or different from New Delhi urban folks, but I get that. But we're discussing role-playing games. Often we have to use big brushes for these things. So if we have an urban template, and then you have that maybe divided, maybe also you also have the aspect of which economic strata that you are from. Combine those two things plus your ancestry. There's your character background. So yeah, you are a dwarf, but you're a dwarf that was raised solid middle class in the city, as opposed to a dwarf that was raised upper class, but in one of the old school mountain steadings. Or one that was raised poor in one of a failed desert colony that never made it, but there are still a group of dwarves trying to eke out survival, in the desert. And they're out there, and you're poor, and you're a dwarf. That's your background. So not every dwarf is going to be saying that. It helps us break up the monoculture. Elves, for example, yeah, they have low light vision. I'm using Pathfinder 3.5 here. They've got all elves have low light vision, at least the surface elves. So yeah, that's consistent throughout. But culturally, things like knowing how to use a longbow and a longsword or a rapier, those are much different things. You're not born knowing how to use a rapier, though you could probably find an interesting setting where some of the skills are actually different video. And so we should separate that so that, again, an elf raised amongst the great, redwood style tree communities is going to have a much different background than one raised in the urban environment who does know how to use a rapier because they were born into money, and they're the son of some important political figure or religious figure. So again, separating out the biological aspects of the ancestry of the person from their cultural aspects. So you could have, maybe you have a dozen cultural templates that you'd plug in to someone's ancestry. And then you also maybe have 3 economic strata that you do that. And if those 3 components, ancestry, culture, economic, environs, bingo, there's your character, and you work from there. So I really like that. Now, when it comes to science fiction settings, culture is still an absolutely appropriate term. I don't like ancestry. It feels archaic to me. When it comes to science fiction or science fantasy, say, for example, Dragonstar or Starfinder, I think species is more appropriate, just because it has that more scientific vibe to it. And I like that for the setting. But it's the same concept as Ancestry. Ancestry just has that kind of rounder, warmer tone, and a term that's more appropriate to a fantasy setting than species. Species is a little clinical, it's a little academic, but it's, to me, more appropriate for a science fiction or science fantasy setting. So you would be discussing, you could still have orcs in Starfinder, but you could also be discussing Vulcans or Romulans or Wookiees or things like that. So you're discussing the species of the creature, but you can also discuss their culture. So a Wookiee raised on its home world is going to be much different than, say, an orphan that was raised on Tatooine. Say somebody finds a baby Wookiee and they raise it in Tatooine, it may not know its native language at all. Or if it does learn it, it's learning it from someone who isn't a Wookiee, so it ends up knowing the language, but for other Wookiees, it's got a really weird accent. You know? So that's a different culture. It was raised outside of its own species, homeworld. And we also should remember that among Wookiees, maybe there's more than one culture. What a concept, I know. Not monolithic Wookiees, not monolithic Vulcans, not monolithic Romulans. I know. Who would have thought? No monocultures. All right, I've babbled on for almost 11 minutes here. But you get the point. Using ancestry or species instead of the word race is far more appropriate, much less loaded terms. And culture, of course, is a neutral term, regardless of whether you're discussing fantasy or science fiction or fantasy. So I'm very on board with the use of culture, regardless of what your gaming genre is. So let's talk about how we pull ourselves out of the 20th century and pull ourselves into the 21st. How we discuss the biological backgrounds of our characters, where they're from, and trying not to play up those racist tropes that have existed for so long that we just didn't think about because, well, for the most part, white people were in charge, and we're really bad at thinking about racist issues. And the people that we got the information from sometimes were overtly racist, and some were just themselves raised in racist environments, so they're transferring their, implied racism along to us, and we just don't notice it. That's our privilege, and it's important that we address it, because if we don't, we're just perpetuating problems of the past, and we are becoming the problem of the future.